Good afternoon again, and thank you to everybody who's joined us today. Our presentation today is from the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, Innovation and Excellence in Natural Systems Adaptation, featuring the work of the Huron River Watershed Council on their Climate Resilience Communities project. We're joined today by Rebecca Esselman and Daniel Brown, who will be telling us about the work that took place through this project, successes, lessons learned, and potential applications for replication in other communities. To begin, let me share a little bit about the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. I am the managing director. My name is Beth Gibbons, and I'm so pleased to be presenting on our overall program and mission as we go out to work on supporting and connecting adaptation professionals while advancing excellence and innovation in the adaptation field. ESOP strives to achieve these missions through 4 program areas of member network and support, field standardization and advancement, policy, education and advocacy, and providing a voice for the field. Through these 4 program areas, we seek to build the capacity of individual climate adaptation professionals while also advancing and accelerating the field of climate change adaptation so that we have a more prepared, resilient communities and country. You can learn more about ESOP at our website, and I encourage you all to visit there and encourage you to be joining us so that we can continue to expand our network and expand our work. This webinar is part of a series which features the finalists and winners from the ESOP Prize for Progress. The ESOP Prize for Progress is designed to improve professional practice in adapting to climate change by highlighting the practices of communities across the United States that have reduced net losses and decreased vulnerability to extreme weather and climate change. However, the Prize for Progress goes beyond just providing a prize and an award, but through the curation and promotion of these practices, we seek to advance and to improve practice overall. We do that through the featuring of webinars, through the creation of case studies, and through encouraging people to connect and to learn from one another so that they might replicate the best practices that we're recognizing taking place across the country. To be a winner or a finalist for the Prize for Progress, you have to meet 3 criteria. A program or project must reflect effectiveness, which is to say the extent to which the project or initiative has achieved tangible results in reducing and decreasing vulnerability to climate change and weather. It has to be significant, and this means the extent to which the project or initiative addresses a significant climate issue, which will matter both to the community where the action took place, but also have significance across a range of communities that may be experiencing similar climate impacts. And the program must reflect innovation. The Prize for Progress seeks to identify the most forward-looking and innovative practices taking place in the field. And so we're looking for projects that don't just reflect significant and effective work, but also innovative, creative, and projects that advance us all as a field. It's with these criteria in mind that I'm so happy to be introducing our presenters today. Rebecca Esselman, who is with the Huron River Watershed Council, and Daniel Brown, who supported the project. HRWC was a 2017 finalist. And our 2 presenters who will be taking over shortly. Rebecca Esselman is a watershed planner with HRWC. Rebecca leads their climate adaptation work for natural systems and watershed communities, including serving as a project manager for the Climate Resilience Communities project. Prior to joining HRWC, Rebecca spent 10 years with the Nature Conservancy, working in conservation planning and knowledge sharing. Rebecca holds a master's in science and conservation ecology from the University of Georgia, where she focused on watershed issues, and a Bachelor of Science in Botany from Michigan State University. Our second presenter, Daniel Brown, is the Climate Change Program Coordinator at Mass Audubon. And through this work, Dan works with communities across New England to recognize and respond to climate threats. Daniel's background includes a dual master's degree in nuclear physics and atmospheric science, and he has worked as a climate researcher and climatologist for the University of Michigan and the University of Oregon, and his previous position was with the Great Lakes Integrated Science and Assessment Center. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca, and you can take us away.
Okay, are you hearing me?
I am.
All right, great. Well, thank you all for joining the call today to listen in on a overview of a project that we completed here in the Huron River Watershed. The watershed's located in southeast Michigan. That map gives you a little bit of an orientation. Our biggest city is Ann Arbor, and the watershed drains to Lake Erie just south of Detroit. Next slide. I wanted to start by giving you a really high-level project background just to contextualize what you'll hear throughout the presentation. But before I even do that, I want to cue you into kind of 3 outcomes I feel are significant from this work that this audience may be interested in. First of all, the process that we developed here, the approach that we took is very exportable and something that might be useful to you with your communities and your location. We've also produced a suite of products that, while catered to our spot on the map, also have application outside of this project. And I'll be providing links to the location of some of those products throughout the talk. And then the third thing that came out of this project that we can't emphasize enough is that through participation in this project, community members that we worked with have become kind of climate champions within municipalities and agencies throughout the watershed, and that has a real lasting impact on the kind of adaptation potential of our communities. So with that as the 3 things to pay attention to, I'll launch into some project background. The Climate Resilient Communities Project was 3 years. 2012 through 2015. So we have a couple of years removed from it, and we can talk a little bit about what we've seen happen since then. Just to give you an idea of the scale of it, our budget was about $200,000. The funding came primarily from GLESA, and then a pretty large number of several local family foundations. So it wasn't a single chunk of money. We did some fundraising and got different amounts from several sources to piece together the project. The impetus from the Huron River Watershed Council's perspective, why we started engaging in this project, and this was actually one of the Watershed Council's very first climate-focused projects. The reason that we started writing proposals to do this, and out of that was born the CRC project that we're talking about today, is that we were hearing questions from the people that we support, the municipal staff, water resource managers from throughout the watershed, saying, what should I be paying attention to? How should I be doing things different? They were looking for a climate resource in us, and we wanted to be able to provide that. Dan, did you want to talk about GLESA's involvement?
Right, so GLESA kind of had an eye on Huron River and how that would fit into a larger mission that we had sort of bubbling to the surface around this time. So rather than funding traditional academic research projects like a number of other climate centers were doing, we got the idea to really go after what we call boundary organizations, groups that are bridging this gap, and really try to look at creating a self-sustaining regional climate network that has this real connection to a local area, a local resource, and a way of building sort of a sustainable conversation around all of the issues facing that specific area. So this was, I think, really the first project where we started doing that, and that helped develop a lot of the other materials that came after, and helped develop a lot of the other ideas that fit into our GLESA approach after that.
Yeah, so for clarification, Dan is now with Mass Audubon, but during the tenure of this project, he was working for GLESA, our Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments Group. And so the two of us were kind of co-leads on this project, and in the room together with practitioners every time over the course of this 3 years. So my role in general was the facilitator of meetings with what we did was we organized around 3 different sectors, water resource sectors. So we had a group focused on in-stream flows, a group focused on natural infrastructure, and a group focused on stormwater. So I facilitated these group discussions that brought together climate scientists and water resource practitioners. And then the hat I wore most of the time was cat herder, just making sure people got into the room, did their homework, helped really do the thinking necessary to come up with meaningful products for our area. And Dan had a different role. I'll let him speak to.
Right. So we said listener and translator, and that's really how I thought of myself. So I was glad when Rebecca put this together. She picked exactly the same couple of words. Yeah, I mean, my role was really to listen to the needs of the group and to try and tailor the climate information to the needs of the group and the practical on the ground resources that they needed. One thing that often comes up in projects like these is that it is impossible for somebody looking at the climate data that's trained in climatology to think through all of the possible ways that the data could be spliced apart and used most effectively. What thresholds do communities need? How should the data be presented? What are the bylaws that are really getting in the way? All of these kind of things. So it was really my role to kind of be the backside of the iterative loop. So I'm presenting some of the climate information that had come before and was accessible, but really my role was to take back how that information was most useful and try to improve on it with each iteration and each phase of this project and then the projects that came after.
Yeah, so you'll see as we get into some of the products how the members of these sectors came together with Dan and really crafted highly catered products that would enable kind of climate-informed decision-making within that sector. So the investments that our participants had to make, they met monthly with us for the first 6 months, and then they met quarterly with us after that. So there was a decent amount of investment from our practitioners, but everybody experienced a value and walked away with something from that investment. And so what we were able to achieve took time and it took effort of a large number of individuals, but we do feel like what we ended up with achieved the goal, which was to get folks decision-ready information and have them start changing practice. Okay, you can go to the next slide.
Yeah, so here we're just kind of describing, what the basic approach was that we took. So, as I mentioned before, we had this approach that Glisa had thought of, that some of our social science researchers would work with, our climate scientists, and thought through really how do we structure an approach, how do we structure a network, based on the social science research on the climate data that really most effectively bridges from science to practice. So how do we get this information in a usable format, in a useful format, so that it can be used on the ground? So we had, as the graphic shows, we had organizations and agencies, municipalities around the table with what I would call, the convener and the leader of the whole project, with Huron River, and then we had Glisa as one of the support agencies, that's listening and providing information throughout the process. But we'll get to this in a little bit, but one of the key points is that you have all of those key elements around the table. This practitioners and decision makers type of audience, this audience supportive climate scientists, and then really this trusted convener or facilitator, which we had with HRWC. We'll go to the next slide. And then here's a graphic showing how we imagine this Glisa approach, this boundary chain model, really working. So we have climate science, we have GLESA sitting immediately on the edge of that climate science boundary, really working with the climate information, working with the data, tailoring it to municipalities, to specific areas or topics or regimes. And then from GLESA, we have this set of first tier really leading boundary organizations. So these would be groups like leading municipalities, really capable nonprofits like HRWC and others. So in this model, I would say HRWC is probably that bubble right dead center. And the idea is that you engage, we would target and really engage with groups that we thought had a good capacity to bridge between science and practice. And then we talk about a particular idea or a particular issue and really improve awareness throughout that organization, throughout the organizations they support. And by doing that, you really create this culture of, an informed culture that is really ready to engage on the practice of incorporating climate change and what do they do. So, the city of Ann Arbor might be one of those other top tier bubbles. City of Ypsilanti or Washtenaw County might be another one. But you have a group where everybody around an idea is talking about the same idea, and maybe they're bringing their own expertise and perspectives to the table. So you're building on that expertise. But then as you work together and you create this sustained networking relationship, that conversation gets stronger with iterations and sharing that partner perspective. So it allows essentially interest in whatever the idea is, be that stormwater or flooding or dealing with forest fires, whatever the topic is that you're concerned about. The idea was that there would be this momentum behind those topics. So that's what we move forward on. Next slide.
Okay, yeah, and I would say, so an illustration of how that boundary chain worked in our circumstances. We're a 50-year-old organization that worked with the 63 municipalities within our watershed over that time period. So we had that network established and were perceived as a trusted advisor. But my ability to speak about climate impacts in our region was very limited. Through the relationship with GLESA over that 3 years, my capacity has increased greatly to where now I can play that role. And, other partners that were engaged with us can do that as well. So GLESA is able to step back their investment, and there's folks here that have that capacity now. So that was a nice outcome of this project as well. So what I want to switch gears into now is to orient you to the sector teams that we worked with and kind of where they got with what their sector needed to become more adapted to climate change. The Natural Infrastructure Group, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly in lieu of time, but I do provide links to where you can learn more about the work of these teams online. The Natural Infrastructure Group was made up of land managers, urban foresters, land conservancies, that type of folk. And what they really wanted to know was how was forest composition going to change over time? How were they to know, what lands to protect and what species to protect and what their fate would be and how these systems would sort themselves out? We had to scale that back based on the science available at the time and our understanding of how ecosystems are going to change. So we looked specifically at key tree species in the watershed and looked at whether future climate was going to be more or less favorable for those species. We put those into fact sheets and disseminated them to key audiences. And we also created a packet of information and PowerPoint presentation that would allow people that had learned this to pass it along to others. So if you go to the next slide, Beth. The table on the left is the tree species that we looked at. This is just a synthesis chart that shows the different species we analyzed and whether future climate was going to be more favorable, less favorable, or kind of neutral for that species. You get more detail at the level of the fact sheet, which starts talking about the implications of climate change on specific species and range shifts. And then we also developed a report on the management implications of this, which was a literature review. And again, it had that accompanying presentation, which allowed sort of a train the trainer model. Once you knew the content, you could pass it along to others in your sector. So this tree resilience toolkit is available at that address in the corner. Next slide. The water infrastructure group were focused primarily on urban stormwater. And this group honed in on a very significant need that has application very broadly. So they acknowledged right out of the gate that the rainfall frequency curves, or the design storms that they use to make stormwater-related decisions, were sorely out of date. They didn't incorporate the most recent 30 years of data, let alone anything forward-looking. So they said, if nothing else, we need to do better with that, because we're designing our systems for a climate that's far out of date. The second one was kind of a softer strategy. They just wanted a series of high-priority, no-regrets actions. If you remember, this was a good number of years ago now, and at least in our area, talking about climate was challenging, and so they wanted some strategies that they could present to, more reluctant audiences that had no regrets. In other words, they made sense in the current context of the climate and would help if climate was changing. So they did that as well. But I'm going to dive deeper into that first one on the next slide. So this is a quick look at the type of data used to make stormwater decisions. Anyone that's familiar with that field will recognize this kind of information. So you have, your 100-year storm, your 10-year 12-hour storm, and these are rainfall volumes. So the first number. So let's take the 2-year 24-hour storm. That first number, 2.26, is the volume in inches that this storm was for our region based on the old standards. Once they were updated in a new resource, NOAA Atlas 14, that the volume increased to 2.35. Okay, that's a 4% increase in rainfall falling during that event. And this one, for example, is what stormwater managers use to design outlet restrictions for detention ponds. If you look at the 10-year 12-hour event, that's a common design standard for a level of service for stormwater conveyance. Those were at least 7% undersized. And if you look up at the 100-year storm, we had a 17% increase in volume falling during that event. And that is used to define our floodplain boundaries and detention basins. So it was very obvious very quickly that we were under-designing our systems and we needed better data. So this got packaged up into a series of fact sheets. It's about a 14-page document targeting stormwater managers specifically, handing them very decision-ready information. And that can be found in this report, The Implications of Precipitation Changes in Southeast Michigan, at that link that you see on the page. Next slide. The third team was the Instream Flows group. These were folks, dam operators, engineers, hydrologists that had concerns or responsibility over managing the river itself. And one of the main things that one of their main responses to hearing about how climate was changing in this area was, we don't talk enough. Okay, so what the context in the Huron River is that we have 17 main stem dams, 10 different owners of those dams, and other than maybe the guy operating the dam next, downstream from you, there's very little communication in and among these operations. And so they felt to be better prepared for climate changes and potentially extreme events, they needed to be networked. They also felt like we did not have enough data, and this is a common problem throughout the country. The USGS stream gauges that have given us a lot of our flow data historically are becoming increasingly cost prohibitive in places and are going offline. So we're losing our hydrologic data that helps us manage water better. So they also wanted to see additional stream gauges come online to help manage the system better. Okay, next slide. So the product that came out of this is less tangible, but really rich. So we created this Huron River Dams network, and this group meets twice a year, is still doing that. So we've got 4 years running now that we've met twice a year with this team of folks that represent all 10 agencies that operate dams on the Huron. And in the spring, we have kind of an indoor meeting where we roll up our sleeves and talk about issues of shared interest to all of us. And in the fall, we go out and we see an operation in practice and talk about, you know, on-site issues and do some problem solving there and learn a lot about each other's operations and how they work. The unique thing about this group is that they're able to look system-wide and start focusing on issues at that watershed scale, which before they were just really worried about the, you know, either hydropower production or the level of their reservoir and responding to recreational users' needs, and they weren't looking at the system as a whole. So we've been able to have conversations about environmental flows, dam safety, additional data, and then just having these folks know each other and be better networked. They have an email listserv, they know each other by name and face, they have all recent contact information. Should there be a major event or a catastrophic event, they're far more prepared to respond as a group than they were in the past. Okay, next slide. So I wanted to then kind of propagate the work we did in those teams out to how it's touched a city. So this is just an example of how one city is changing in response to the work that we did in those groups. And I'm going to talk about Ann Arbor. They're our largest city, the largest population, and they have a lot of capacity. So in all fairness, not all of our communities are going to achieve this, but I wanted to show you the potential of where this information can go. In response to the recommendations to use improved stormwater data, the county that Ann Arbor is in revised their stormwater rules. And Ann Arbor chose to codify those changes. At the county level, those rules can change over time. And Ann Arbor wanted to ensure that they stuck with these revised rules, because these revised rules use the new data, require more on-site infiltration, and planning for larger future events. Another thing they had underway was developing a calibrated stormwater model that really let them look at the city with a level of sophistication that they hadn't had before. They used the Atlas 14, the revised data, to do that. And what it allows them to do is look at the impacts of different storm events and potential future events on their city. It helps them identify problem areas and figure out optimal solutions. They were able to identify a whole slew of new buildings that may be in harm's way because they mapped the floodplain with revised 100-year storm, which was the one that was 17% bigger than what the map was originally created on. And they were able to compare it to the FEMA map, and the green areas on that image are new floodplain areas. They also are planning on using this to prioritize projects and get them into the capital improvement plan. So they have strong rationale now for getting funds allocated to this work. They are in the process of raising their stormwater fees. There's a stormwater utility in Ann Arbor that can also pay for a lot of this work, and they're increasing the fees in order to be able to confront this problem. And they're also working on an ordinance to limit development 1 foot above the 500-year flood, so more stricter development criteria. Next slide. Other things that they're doing outside the stormwater sector, they utilized the climate data developed to develop their urban and community forest management plan, and they revised their approved street tree list based on the research we did on how species were going to fare here in the future climate. They've also incorporated climate change into their hazard mitigation plan revision. That's ongoing right now, and the level to which they're bringing climate change into their HMP is really great. It's definitely a step forward for anywhere in Michigan, and I think it's probably pretty competitive nationally for the degree to which they address climate change in this plan. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is that the dam operation, they've actually chose to modify the timing of dam repairs to adhere to recommended in-stream flow recommendations that we put out there. So the take home here is that they're changing the way they do things to be more delicate on the river ecosystem and avoid detrimental flows during our spawning season. So that's just a little look at how some of this information has moved the needle on adaptation in one of our cities. I'll turn it over to Dan to do some reflecting on our lessons learned.
Yeah, next slide. Yeah, there we go.
So, thinking back, some time to reflect on this project, some of the successes we had, certainly I think the biggest one was getting people to make time for climate adaptation, really committing to learning and understanding more about climate change. So just improving climate literacy among the group that we were working with directly, but then among each of the groups that our partners were working with. They were taking us back to their own offices, talking about it more. Each of us was getting asked to do talks on similar topics and get connected throughout a network that way. So we're improving climate literacy as we went. Some of the strategies, as Rebecca pointed out, were already being implemented. Some of the planning was already happening around some of these projects. So incorporating the climate change information and taking it a bit further was certainly something we were able to do, as you saw in the example with Ann Arbor. It also allows for improves fundraising for adaptation, and this is something we've, I think, continued to see elsewhere, is that climate change really does enhance the urgency for a lot of the issues that we're talking about. And I think one thing that was really innovative at the time, and a credit to Rebecca for this, was that thinking about a new sector and how do you get hazard mitigation, emergency managers on board. That was something at the time was still relatively new, even just 4 or 5 years ago. And it's something we're seeing get adopted at the state scale here in Massachusetts, where they're really making this conscious effort to get climate change incorporated into hazard mitigation planning and emergency management. We're seeing that across the country now, but at the time it was really innovative, and this was, I think, one of the projects that started help moving the needle in that direction. Some of the challenges that we faced, and I think some of these still hold true, but I think in others, we've moved past them since then. There's still a concern about limitation of data, and in some case, a very justified concern, as Rebecca pointed out, with the USGS stream gauges. The climate data has become far more accessible, even in just a few years. But there was certainly this need to talk about the limitation of data. There was concern throughout the group and everybody involved about how much can we say about the climate data we have. What message can we draw from what the data says? At the time, there was a lot of suspicion about climate projections and what the range of uncertainty was going forward. I think for a whole number of reasons that are way beyond the scope of this project, that has improved. But one thing that definitely happened is it helped all of us figure out how to communicate climate models and climate projections more effectively. That's something that really helped GLESA improve its message in the years following this project. And a number of national organizations and national efforts really tried to gather a coherent climate narrative on a regional scale. And all of those efforts really helped, I think, improve or alleviate some of the suspicion about climate projections and around what could we draw from that's meaningful about this projection. So I think we're much better about explaining, here's what the projections say, here's the limitation, here's what is meaningful about those projections. One thing, there are 63 municipalities, in the Huron River watershed. That's of course tremendously complex. Rebecca did a great job of herding everybody together as much as you can, but that's a challenge when you get that many groups together. We see the same thing in Massachusetts with 351 independent fiefdoms that really have home rule over their territory. So getting towns to work together here, it's the same issue. So that continues, I think, to be one of the big issues with this type of project. Maintaining team energy. Anytime you have a project like this that can get pretty detailed, there are times where things were moving slower, and then we figure out something new and get kind of a surge of interest. But Rebecca did a good job of trying to maintain team energy, recruiting new people as other people atrophied. And throughout that whole process, we found a good set of champions, kind of our core team that kind of emerged from all of that. But maintaining team energy takes a lot of effort, a lot of work. Engaging unlikely partners, anybody that you can imagine that's skeptical or may not be as directly involved, it's tough to figure out how to get them involved. So you're thinking about your local businesses, developers, contractors, other groups that have competing interests. Anybody that might be an unlikely partner can be tough to engage. And then something that we see consistently is that there's a lag time to implementation. We're seeing a lot of the fruits of our labor now, but it's been several years, and that is something that's true no matter where you go. From the science, figuring out what you want to advocate, and then figuring out how to implement that can take several years. Next slide. So one quick lesson that I learned in terms of communicating climate science, and we incorporated this into GLESA work throughout the later parts of the project, but then in other projects, was that you actually don't want to dump a huge amount of climate information and science on a new conglomeration of people all at once. You want to get them invested in the project and thinking about it. So we started calling this a vulnerabilities first approach. You want to get them thinking about what are the vulnerabilities, what are the issues they care about and think about, and then how does climate change fit into that, or how does it not fit into those things that they're worried about. And this is an approach that they've used with the Climate Resilience Toolkit since then, that we helped to inform a bit, and this project was certainly the project that helped us figure out that was an issue. If you dump everything on somebody in a plenary session, you have to keep coming back and re-explaining things to them. If you kind of integrate it when they're ready for it, things go a lot more smoothly. Next slide. Another one I learned is that null results are useful, and we saw that with Rebecca talking about the dam operators group in particular, where we went through a lot of different scenarios, talked about a lot of different climate data. It turned out that most of the dams are the critical issues. The dams had been pretty well built for. The challenge was really responding to these hyper local, very short time frame weather events. So there's no amount of climate data that's going to improve that. But through that whole discussion that went on for a few meetings, we identified the dam operators were not really talking to each other, and that was really the genesis of that dam operators group, and just improving communication in the watershed. So even when you turn up a null result that, the climate information doesn't really help something here, can also improve your resilience in other ways. Next slide. So I talked about the wide-angle lens of climate change. That was certainly a unifying call. When everybody from different perspectives sits around the same table, starts thinking about these issues at a regional scale, at a watershed scale, through a lens of climate change, it forces you to think in terms of systems and systems of systems. And that was hugely beneficial, and I think that's one of the key things we learned from this project. What we've tried to do since then, certainly something I continue to try to do, is get people to think in that wide-angle lens. We had people from critical entities that were all engaged. That certainly helped enable action, so that there's sort of this key ingredients that you need to make the perfect cake on this. So here we had HRWC, we had Ann Arbor, we had folks from the county and other cities. We had climate organization, interpreting the data, translating the science. And you need all of those pieces. You need sort of each layer of government and geographic scale that you're going to work in, along with somebody that can interpret the data. And then you need a strong facilitator or convener. And you need all of those ingredients to make it successful. And then within each of those entities, we had somebody that was a true practitioner, and somebody that was a director being involved at various stages. And having that scale of responsibility and what people are thinking about really helps generate meaningful results that can actually be implemented on the ground. And then, as Rebecca talked about, I think maybe the most important thing that came out of this was that this project, as we got people together from different perspectives, it really empowered this core team of climate champions. There are people that got a lot out of this project, that were really engaged in the project, put a lot into it, and they continue to be now leaders in the region around climate change and around a lot of the issues that we talked about. And that's been really inspiring to see continue. Next slide. And then one thing, just reflecting on it myself. So how do we replicate this? Well, the things we were learning from this project while I was at GLESA, it really was one of our flagship projects, and we tried to replicate it in each of the projects that we were doing, in parallel or immediately following. So all of the lessons that you're hearing now, we were trying to incorporate those into projects that were going on at the time. Just a couple quick examples. So, thinking about how do we communicate the data, one thing was, how do you make this visible, tangible to people, rather than talking about precipitation in the abstract. So we talked about, how many Michigan stadiums for the city of Ann Arbor, how many Michigan stadiums would be filled with the change in precipitation over time. And we did that there as a communication piece to really improve climate literacy around stormwater management in Ann Arbor. And we've tried similar things with that in now other communities where I've worked, where you pick a landmark, you figure out the volume of the landmark, the precipitation change, you try to communicate a change in precipitation that way. But you can do the same thing for changes in growing seasons or other things, where it's how do you communicate these big changes effectively, what's going to resonate with people. And this is really the first project where we tried to do that. And then, as you can see, I've pulled out, this is a slide on the right from work we're doing in Massachusetts now. Those are Massachusetts cities where we're looking at exactly the same issue. And the same issue in Southeast Michigan applies in exactly the same way to communities in Massachusetts, where they're using this obsolete data. They're using NOAA TP40 out here instead of this NOAA Atlas 14, and you can see the change. So this is, again, one of the key challenges, is getting communities to use that newer data. And that was absolutely something that I got from working on this project where that was not something I ever would have noticed had I not worked on this project with HRWC in Ann Arbor. This issue that the data, that the regulations, the guidelines were using this obsolete data and not NOAA Atlas 14. And that's now something that has been incorporated into the Massachusetts state curriculum that they're developing out here. And all of that came from meetings that we had at HRWC a few years ago. So those are some of the pieces that we've pulled from this project we're using elsewhere. And I know people at EPA, at least several months ago, that are involved with the National Climate Assessment and other climate centers, they are now keenly aware of this issue of using newer data, using the NOAA Atlas 14 data or other similar sources going forward. So this idea of updating extreme precipitation thresholds and even projecting what those extreme precipitation thresholds will look like at 2050 or 2100, that's now a priority for a lot of the agencies looking at this. And I hope that we've helped move the needle on that.
Yeah, so that's what we have to present to you all. I wanted to put a couple of Dan and my contact information if you want to follow up with us on any of this. And then also there's 2 websites. The Climate Resilient Communities page that HRWC hosts has more about the project, and you can find the resources. The GLESA link leads you to our project report, which really dives into lessons learned, so an analysis of the process and the project itself if you want to learn more about the approach. We can take questions at this point.
Thank you so much, Rebecca and Dan, for sharing the project and sharing all the lessons learned. I know that you've touched on a lot of this, but when I look at this project and look at it from obviously having been involved in it and then looking at it compared to what's happening across the whole country, the pieces of innovation to me that really jump out, I think you touched on, but that, that working early at a watershed scale and the need for regionalism. Regionalism is often getting focused on in an urban context, but I think HRWC really has led bringing climate into regional conversations in even non-urban and rural areas, and even that rural-urban intersection, and using the river as a way of defining that, I think is very innovative and important. The stormwater plan changes, and then the piece about the there's 2 ways to think about what happened with the dam operators. There's sort of like the null effect, or to me, when I look at it, I see it as a co-benefit. And more we recognize that when you go out to do resilience work, sometimes you're taking it head on, and sometimes you're looking at what is the need in a community and where is resilience a co-benefit, and how do we bring resilience into the discussion in that way. And I think that the dam operator network is so impactful because it was something that was a deep need. And was really recognized through this process. And then you could say, okay, we can help you to identify and to work on what is needed, even though the climate information is perhaps not driving it, but the resilience process and this process that we've gone through to illuminate what is needed brought it to the surface. So I love this project. Thank you both for sharing. And I think there's a number of questions that Emily will help us to moderate.
All right, so it looks like the first question is for Dan. Dan mentioned boundary organizations in respect to other partners for regional collaboration. What is an example of a boundary organization in this case?
Right, so there are different layers or maybe flavors of boundary organizations. We considered GLESA when I was there to be a boundary organization. But a boundary organization is anything that really bridges from science to practice, or is in that chain. So groups like, so HRWC is really a perfect example where they have a working knowledge or a practical knowledge of a lot of the science and data, and have either direct knowledge of how to apply that data, or they know others that will know how to apply that data very directly and locally. Where I am now, Mass Audubon, so we're statewide conservation organization. we are definitely in that category of this boundary organization mold. Some others that I think are pretty prominent. So National Audubon, I would put in that category. They're quite large. Sierra Club, NRDC, groups like that, where they're often interpreting the science. They have the expertise to interpret the science, but they're really working on implementation and getting things to practice.
All right, great. In regards to climate projections, models, accuracy, and specificity, do you see a double-edged sword with increasing accuracy? The example given was, I want to know if my building will stay high and dry in September 2049. Can you model that?
Yeah, so this type of question comes up a lot, where it's, there's a pressure certainly to increase the resolution at what you say in climate models, so doing greater and greater downscaling. Of course, when you do that, just like with a weather report, you're increasing the amount of uncertainty in many ways when you look at this finer and finer resolution. So is it going to rain, or what's going to change about my backyard 50 years from now? That's beyond usually what is realistic. But I think most importantly is that often that's beyond what is really meaningful. It's beyond what is a meaningful interpretation of the data. So what I've tried to start doing, and a lot of that following this project, is really emphasize the idea that what we're talking about is a change from the current status. When we're looking at these climate models, we're talking about relative change in most cases. And even if you hit the relative change with a very broad brush, so even if you paint Ann Arbor, Huron River Watershed with this pretty broad brush, the relative change in the climate models for all of those different places will be about the same, even if they're starting with different microclimates to start with. So the relative change actually doesn't matter much. It's not the climate models that are the limiting factor. It's this hyper-local differences in terrain, topography, other land use decisions. So what I've been trying to effort is that it's really, the climate models are not the issue, and certainly most importantly, we don't want to let the discussion of we need more resolution or we need downscaled climate models before we can move forward on that. Certainly we have enough information to make meaningful adjustments in practice.
Yeah, and I would like to add, through the course of this project, the nice thing about engaging people on multiple occasions, the model that we did where we met with them once a month for 6 months to talk about this stuff. If you get one touch point with somebody and they, that's their question, it's hard to move past that. But when we got these practitioners in the room and they started there, like, when are we going to get, our storms in the spring, and what volume is going to fall, because that has implications for the dam. When Dan came back and said, well, we can't tell you that, and here's some proxies, or here's what we can tell you, they were able to really quickly move past those unanswerables and realize that what we could share with them was also very actionable. And I was surprised from the outset at actually how little information they needed before they said, okay, this is what that means for my, how practices need to change to prepare for this.
All right, and our last question to wrap us up. The Ann Arbor approved street tree list that was revised to incorporate climate information. Is that available somewhere, and how can we find it?
Sure. That's on the City of Ann Arbor's website, so a2gov.org. If you, in their search bar, look for urban forest plan, you'll find that department, and you can find the approved street tree list.
Thanks, and we can certainly add that when we post this webinar. We can post the resource links along with it, and we can also include that tree list along with the other resources. We're just about at the top of the hour, and it looks like the questions we've had come in are wrapped up. I want to take another chance to thank Rebecca and Dan for and I also need to go back and repair my bio for Dan. I introduced him as having a master's degree from University of Michigan, which is totally wrong. It's from Michigan State University, and if you've ever been near Michigan at all, you know what a grave offense that is. Sorry, Dan. Well, Dan's degree is from Michigan State University. He did have the pleasure to work at University of Michigan thereafter. So before we wrap up, I just want to invite everybody to join us for the next 2 installations in this webinar series. Our next session will be with the Menominee Tribal Enterprise, learning about their climate-informed reforestation on Menominee Indian Reservation. And our final presentation will be in December with the U.S. Forest Service preparing for extreme rainfall in the Chemonagan-Nicolet National Forest. I want to thank everyone for their time, for their participation this afternoon, and look forward to seeing all of you again in November.